The day I walked back into the Henderson family estate after 18 years of being nothing more than a ghost in their memories. I wasn't the broken 13-year-old girl they had shipped away to boarding school and conveniently forgotten. I was Madison Cross, now billionaire tech entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and the woman who was about to systematically dismantle everything they held dear. They thought I was dead. They hoped I was forgotten. We're wrong on both counts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Madison Cross, though for the first 13 years of my life, I was Madison Henderson. I was the eldest daughter of Richard and Patricia Henderson, heirs to a shipping fortune that had dominated the Pacific Northwest for 3 generations. I had 2 younger siblings, twins, Axela Jonathan and Jessica, who were born when I was 5 years old and immediately became the golden children who could do no wrong. Growing up in the Henderson mansion in Bellevue, Washington, I learned early that love was conditional and attention was scarce. My parents had tried for years to have children before I came along, and when I finally arrived, I think they were disappointed that I wasn't the son they desperately wanted to carry on the family name. When the twins were born a boy and a girl, I became surplus to requirements overnight. Jonathan was everything my father wanted in an heir. Even as a toddler, he was charming, confident, and naturally gifted at winning people over. Jessica was my mother's precious princess, delicate and beautiful with blonde ringlets and blue eyes that made everyone melt. I was the awkward middle child, with mousy brown hair and thick glasses, more interested in computers and books than tea parties or sports. The Henderson family had a tradition of sending their children to exclusive boarding schools, but most kids went when they were 15 or 16. I was sent away at 13. Right after a particularly embarrassing incident at one of my mother's charity galas where I accidentally spilled red wine on a major donor's wife. The woman made a scene. My mother was mortified, and by Monday morning, my bags were packed. Cedar Ridge Academy was nestled in the mountains of Montana, hours away from any major city. It was the kind of place where wealthy families sent their problem children, the ones who didn't fit the mold, who were too weird, too quiet, too much trouble. The kind of place where you could disappear completely and no one would notice. I remember calling home every Sunday for the first few months, begging to come back for holidays, for summer break, for anything. My mother's voice was always strained and distant. There was always some excuse. The twins had activities. Father was traveling. The house was being renovated. Eventually, I stopped calling. Eventually, they stopped answering. Cedar Ridge Academy became my prison and my salvation. All at once. While my classmates were troubled rich kids acting out for attention, I threw myself into academics and technology with a desperate hunger. The school had a surprisingly advanced computer lab, probably funded by some tech billionaire trying to reform their own wayward child, and I spent every free moment there. By the time I was 15, I was already building websites for local businesses in the nearby town. By 16, I had created my first APO simple scheduling program that I sold to the school for $5,000. It was my first taste of financial independence, and it was intoxicating. The other students thought I was weird, the teachers thought I was brilliant, and my family thought I was non-existent. I received exactly 3 pieces of mail from the Henderson family during my 5 years at Cedar Ridge. The first was a birthday card when I turned 15, clearly picked out by an assistant and signed by my mother in her neat, impersonal handwriting. The second was a Christmas card 2 years later with a photo of my parents and the twins at some tropical resort. I wasn't in the picture, obviously. I was at school, spending Christmas break in an empty dormitory with 3 other forgotten children. The third piece of mail changed everything. It arrived during my senior year, just 2 weeks before graduation. It was a letter from a law firm in Seattle, informing me that my maternal grandmother, woman I had barely known but who had apparently been keeping track of me, had passed away and left me a trust fund worth $2 million. The money would be available to me on my 18th birthday. With one condition, I had to legally change my last name and could never use the Henderson name for financial gain. Even from the grave, my grandmother was giving me an escape route and a message. She knew what my parents had done. She knew I had been discarded like yesterday's newspaper, and she was giving me the tools to build a life without them. Never returned to the Henderson house after graduation. I didn't even attend my own graduation ceremony. Instead, I took the small amount of savings I had accumulated from my various tech projects, bought a bus ticket to San Francisco, and never looked back. San Francisco in the early 2000s was like the Wild West for anyone with programming skills and big dreams. I enrolled at UC Berkeley, majoring in computer science and business, and spent every free moment building my skills and my network. Trust fund money gave me freedom to take risks that other students couldn't afford. During my sophomore year, I created a social media platform specifically for college students that predated Facebook by 6 months. I sold it to a larger tech company for $15 million before my 21st birthday. Suddenly I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. The tech world embraced me in a way my family never had. Here, being weird was an asset. Being obsessive about details was valued. Being able to see patterns and opportunities that others missed made me valuable. I reinvested every dollar I made, started 3 more companies. By the time I was 25, I was worth over $100 million. But success wasn't enough. I wanted more than money. I wanted recognition, respect, and most importantly, I wanted the power to never be discarded again. I threw myself into venture capitalism, using my wealth to fund other brilliant outcasts and misfits who reminded me of my younger self. Within 5 years, my investment firm, Cross Ventures, had a portfolio worth over $1 billion. I changed more than just my financial status during those years. I transformed everything about myself, gone with the thick glasses, replaced by contacts, and eventually laser surgery. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The mousy brown hair became a sleek auburn bob styled by the best colorists in Beverly Hills. I learned how to dress, how to speak with authority, how to command a room full of executives twice my age. Most importantly, I learned how to be invisible when I wanted to be, and impossible to ignore when it suited my purposes. I developed a network of information brokers, private investigators, and former employees from dozens of companies. I knew which CEO was having an affair, which startup was cooking their books, and which established company was about to be disrupted by new technology. For 15 years, I built my empire while keeping tabs on the Henderson family from a distance. They never knew I was watching, never suspected that the awkward 13-year-old they had forgotten had become one of the most powerful people in tech. They lived their comfortable lives in their bubble of old money and social connections, completely unaware that their discarded daughter had become someone they would have desperately wanted to claim if they had known. Jonathan had followed the expected path: Harvard Business School, a prestigious job at an investment bank, marriage to a senator's daughter, 2 perfect children, and a house in the right neighborhood. He was being groomed to take over Henderson Shipping when my father retired, just as everyone had always planned. Jessica had married young to a tech executive, ironically, someone whose company I had funded and later helped to sell for $900 million. She was the perfect society wife, organizing charity events and serving on museum boards. Living the life my mother had probably intended for me before I proved to be such a disappointment. My parents were in their 70s now, still active in their social circles, but beginning to slow down. Henderson Shipping was still profitable, but facing increasing pressure from more innovative competitors. The company needed fresh capital and new leadership to survive the next decade. But they were too proud and too set in their ways to admit it, and that's where I came in. The plan I had been formulating for years was finally ready to execute. It wasn't enough to simply reveal myself and demand recognition. That would give them the opportunity to spin the narrative, to claim they had always loved me, to try to bring me back into the fold on their terms. No, what I wanted was complete, followed by the systematic dismantling of everything they had built while I was gone. I started small, the way I always did. Henderson Shipping's biggest contracts were with companies that shipped goods from Asia to the Pacific Northwest. Over the past 5 years, I had quietly invested in or acquired stakes in 7 of their top 10 clients. I now had significant influence over the companies that provided 60% of Henderson Shipping's revenue. The beauty of modern corporate structures is how easy it is to hide ownership through shell companies, investment funds, and proxy agreements. The Henderson family had no idea that the anonymous investor group that had been slowly buying up shares in their client companies was actually their forgotten daughter. Phase 1 of my plan was already in motion before I ever set foot back in Washington state. I began encouraging my client companies to slowly reduce their reliance on Henderson Shipping, citing concerns about their outdated technology and inflexible scheduling. It wasn't difficult to convince them there were indeed better options available, and I made sure those options were companies in my portfolio. Over the course of 18 months, Henderson Shipping lost 40% of their business. I scrambled to find new clients, but the shipping industry is surprisingly small, and word travels fast. Soon, everyone knew that Henderson Shipping was struggling, which made potential clients nervous about signing long-term contracts. My father, Richard Henderson, was forced to take out loans against the company to maintain operations. The family's personal wealth, which had always seemed infinite to me as a child, was increasingly tied up in keeping the business afloat. They sold the vacation house in Aspen. They let go of half their household staff. They canceled their country club memberships, but they still didn't know who was behind their troubles. As far as they knew, it was just bad luck and market forces. The shipping industry was changing, they told themselves. They were victims of economic trends beyond their control. That's when I decided it was time for phase 2. It was time to come home. I had been Madison Cross for so long that putting together a Madison Henderson identity felt like playing dress-up. I created a completely new persona, the lost Henderson daughter, who had been living quietly in Europe, working as a freelance consultant, barely scraping by. I aged down my appearance, chose clothes that suggested struggling finances, and practiced looking smaller and more vulnerable than I had in years. The private investigator I hired to find me was actually one of my regular contractors, a former FBI agent who specialized in corporate intelligence. His job was to approach the Henderson family with news that their long-lost eldest daughter had been located living in a small apartment in Portland. Working part-time jobs and trying to make ends meet, I chose Portland specifically because it was close enough to Bellevue to make the story believable, but far enough away to explain why we had never crossed paths accidentally. I rented a modest apartment, created a paper trail of employment at a small consulting firm I owned through a shell company, and waited for my family to come looking for their forgotten daughter. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October. My mother's voice was older than I remembered, more fragile, but still carrying that tone of carefully controlled emotion that had characterized every conversation from my childhood. "Madison, darling, is it really you?" I had practiced this conversation 100 times, but hearing her voice after 18 years of silence still hit me like a physical blow. For just a moment, I was 13 again, desperately wanting my mother to love me, to choose me, to see me as worthy of her attention. But I had learned to control my emotions long ago. I let my voice shake just slightly, let her hear the uncertainty, and hope that the daughter she remembered would have felt. "Mom, I can't believe you found me. I thought you didn't want to see me anymore." The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of manipulation on both sides. She claimed they had tried to find me, that they had been heartbroken. When I stopped returning their calls from boarding school, I pretended to believe her while giving just enough details about my difficult life to make them feel the appropriate amount of guilt. Within a month, they were begging me to move back to Bellevue so we could rebuild our relationship. Within 3 months, my father was offering me a job at Henderson Shipping, claiming he wanted to teach me the family business and prepare me for a leadership role.
I believe.
It was almost laughably easy. They were so desperate to assuage their guilt and so panicked about the company's financial troubles that they convinced themselves I was the answer to their prayers.
Yeah.
Their prodigal daughter returned home with fresh ideas and youthful energy, ready to help save the family legacy. What they didn't know was that I already owned that legacy. What they didn't realize was that the salvation they thought I represented was actually the architect of their destruction. I moved back into my childhood bedroom in the Henderson mansion just before Christmas. I was 28 years old and finally ready to collect the debt my family had owed me for 18 years. They welcomed me with tears and apologies and promises that things would be different this time. They were right about one thing. Things were definitely going to be different. The first family dinner in 18 years was held in the formal dining room where I had spent countless childhood evenings, sitting in silence while my parents discussed business and the twins chattered about their accomplishments. The mahogany table that had once seemed enormous to my 13-year-old eyes now felt appropriately sized. Though the chairs were positioned exactly as I remembered, father at the head, mother to his right, Jonathan across from her, Jessica beside him, and me relegated to the far end where I could be easily forgotten. Only this time, they had moved me closer. This time, I was seated in the place of honor to my father's left, while Jonathan had been shifted down one seat. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of us, though we all pretended not to notice the obvious territorial adjustment. "Look wonderful," my mother said.
Wow.
Though her eyes lingered on my simple black dress and minimal jewelry with barely concealed confusion, she was clearly trying to reconcile the daughter she remembered awkward and poorly dressed, with the woman sitting before her who carried herself with quiet confidence, despite wearing clothes that probably cost less than her monthly manicure. "Budget, thank you, Mother. You haven't changed at all," the lie came easily. She had aged more than I expected, her blonde hair now obviously colored, and her face showing the subtle signs of multiple cosmetic procedures. The rigid posture that had once intimidated me now seemed brittle, as if she was holding herself together through sheer willpower. Jonathan leaned forward, his Harvard MBA confidence radiating across the table. "So Madison, the private investigator, said, you've been working in consulting? What kind of projects have you been handling?" I had prepared for this question extensively, mostly small businesses needing help with operational efficiency and technology integration. And nothing glamorous, but it pays the bills. I smiled self-deprecatingly and took a small sip of the wine that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I've been helping family restaurants implement point-of-sale systems, working with local retailers on inventory management, that sort of thing. Jessica, who had been quiet until now, suddenly brightened. "That's so interesting." "David's company works with restaurants too. He's always talking about how challenging it is to help smaller businesses modernize their operations." David was Jessica's husband and one of the tech executives whose company I had funded through 3 rounds of venture capital before helping orchestrate their acquisition. He had no idea that the anonymous investor who had made him wealthy was sitting at his in-laws' dinner table, pretending to be a struggling consultant. "What's David's company called?" I asked, feigning polite interest while internally calculating how much money I had made from his success. "TechFlow Solutions. They specialize in point-of-sale and inventory management software for hospitality businesses." "I've heard of them," I said truthfully. "They have an excellent reputation in the industry." My father cleared his throat, clearly eager to steer the conversation toward his own interests. "Madison, I hope you'll consider letting me show you around Henderson Shipping tomorrow. I know you were young when you left, but this company has been in our family for 3 generations. It's your legacy, too." The irony was delicious. My legacy. The company that was currently hemorrhaging money and clients thanks to my careful orchestration was apparently my birthright. I let a flicker of genuine emotion cross my face. Not the emotion he expected, but close enough. "I would love that, Father. I've often wondered what became of the business after I left." "We've had some challenges recently," he admitted, his voice taking on the careful tone of a man trying to project confidence while privately panicking. "The industry has become more competitive and some of our long-term clients have moved too. Other providers, but we're adapting, finding new opportunities." I nodded sympathetically while mentally reviewing the list of former Henderson shipping clients who were now contracted with companies in my portfolio. What kind of challenges? Maybe a fresh perspective could help. Jonathan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He clearly didn't appreciate his older sister swooping in and immediately offering business advice, especially when he had been working at the company for 5 years and was supposed to be the heir apparent. "It's complicated," he said, his tone suggesting that I wouldn't understand the intricacies of their situation. "We're dealing with pricing pressures from overseas. competitors and some clients who are prioritizing cost over the quality of service we provide. Have you considered modernizing your fleet tracking systems? I asked innocently.
A lot of.
Shipping companies are using IoT sensors and real-time data analytics to improve efficiency and provide better transparency to clients. The silence that followed my question was telling. My father and Jonathan exchanged glances that confirmed what I already suspected. Henderson Shipping was running on technology that was at least a decade behind industry standards. They were losing clients, not just because I was actively steering business away from them, but because they genuinely couldn't compete with more innovative companies. We've looked into some technological upgrades, my father said carefully. But the initial investment is substantial, and with our current cash flow situation, he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Henderson Shipping was bleeding money and couldn't afford the capital improvements necessary to stay competitive. They were trapped in a death spiral of declining revenue and increasing obsolescence. What if I could help? I offered, letting just enough eagerness creep into my voice to sound believable. I mean, I know I don't have business experience at your level, but I've worked with a lot of companies implementing new technology. I might be able to find cost-effective solutions. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes glistening. With what appeared to be genuine emotion, "Oh, darling, that's so generous of you to offer. But you must be exhausted from rebuilding your own career. Couldn't ask you to take on our problems, too." "You're not asking," I said firmly. "Offering this is my family, and if I can help save something that's been in our family for generations, then I want to try." The conversation continued for another hour, touching on safer topics like Jessica's children, Jonathan's recent promotion to Vice President of Operations, and my parents' plans for their upcoming 40th wedding anniversary. I played my part, perfectly grateful to be home, eager to reconnect, and blissfully unaware of the financial crisis that was slowly destroying everything they had built. When dinner ended, my father pulled me aside for a private conversation in his study. The room was exactly as I remembered it: dark wood paneling, leather-bound books that were probably more for show than reading, and the massive desk where he had signed the papers sending me away to boarding school. "Madison, I want you to know how sorry I am about what happened when you were young," he said, settling into his chair with the careful movements of a man whose confidence had been shaken. "Your mother and I thought we were doing what was best for you, giving you opportunities we couldn't provide at home." I let him see a flash of old pain before quickly covering it with forgiveness. "I understand, Father. Cedar Ridge was actually good for me in many ways. I learned to be independent, to rely on myself. Still, we should have done better. We should have stayed in touch, made sure you knew you were always part of this family." "I'm here now," I said simply. "That's what matters." He leaned forward, his expression becoming more businesslike. "About what you said at dinner, regarding helping with the company, I meant what I said about showing you around tomorrow. But Madison, I need you to understand that the situation is more serious than I let on in front of the others." Widened, my eyes slightly, projecting concern and naivety. "How serious?" "We could lose everything within the next 18 months if we can't turn things around. The bank is calling in some of our loans. We've had to mortgage the house to maintain operations, and if we lose any more major clients," he shook his head. "I never thought I'd see the day when Henderson Shipping might not survive." The house was mortgaged. That was new information, and deliciously ironic. The mansion that had been my childhood prison was now collateral for a failing business. I felt a warm surge of satisfaction, but kept my expression carefully neutral. "Is there anything I can do to help?" I asked. "I don't have much money saved, but if there's some way I can contribute." My father's expression softened. "Having you here, having the family together again, that's worth more than money, sweetheart." If only he knew exactly how much money his struggling daughter actually had. If only he realized that the woman sitting across from him could write a check for the entire value of Henderson Shipping without making a dent in her net worth. The next morning, I dressed carefully in a conservative navy suit that looked professional, but not expensive, and met my father at the Henderson Shipping offices downtown. The building was smaller than I remembered, showing its age in ways that spoke of deferred maintenance and cost-cutting measures. My father walked me through the facility with obvious pride, pointing out the dispatch center, the customer service department, and the executive offices. The technology was indeed outdated computer monitors that belonged in a museum, software interfaces that looked like they hadn't been updated since the 1990s, and filing systems that relied heavily on actual paper files. "This is where it all happens," he said, gesturing toward a room full of employees who were clearly working with tools that made their jobs unnecessarily difficult. "We coordinate shipments for over 200 clients across 15 states. Used to coordinate, I thought to myself, mentally subtracting the 60-plus clients I had already diverted to other shipping companies, but I kept my expression interested and impressed. Jonathan joined us for the second half of the tour, explaining the company's operational procedures with the condescending tone of someone who assumed his audience couldn't possibly understand the complexities involved. He showed me shipping manifests, client contracts, and financial reports that painted a picture of a company in serious decline. "As you can see, we're dealing with some challenging market conditions," he said, pulling up a spreadsheet that showed declining revenues over the past 2 years. "But we're implementing new strategies to diversify our client base and improve operational efficiency." I studied the numbers with genuine interest, though not for the reasons he imagined. This was the first time I had seen the complete financial picture from the inside, and it was even better than I had hoped. Henderson Shipping was in worse shape than my external intelligence had suggested. They were months away from bankruptcy. Not the year to 18 months my father had estimated. "These numbers are concerning," I said, letting worry creep into my voice. "Have you identified what's causing the client attrition?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "It's a combination of factors. Increased competition, pricing pressures, clients switching to companies that offer what they perceive as more modern services." "What kind of modern services?" "Real-time tracking, automated scheduling, integrated logistics management. Basically technology we can't afford to implement right now." I nodded thoughtfully. What if there was a way to implement those technologies without the huge upfront capital investment? Both my father and Jonathan looked at me skeptically. "What do you mean?" my father asked. "Companies lease technology solutions instead of buying them outright. There are companies that specialize in providing software as a service for logistics management. You pay a monthly fee instead of buying the system, and they handle all the updates and maintenance." It was true, though I had deliberately omitted the fact that I owned controlling interests in 3 of the largest companies providing exactly those services. If Henderson Shipping signed contracts with any of them, I would essentially be renting technology to my own family while simultaneously controlling their access to it. Jonathan's expression was skeptical. "We've looked into some of those options, but the monthly costs are still substantial. And we'd be dependent on outside vendors for critical operations. What if I could negotiate better terms?" I offered. "I have relationships with some technology providers from my consulting work. Maybe I could leverage those connections to get you a better deal." My father's eyes lit up with hope. "You would do that for us?" "Of course," I said, reaching over to squeeze his arm. "We're family." The next several weeks fell into a routine that was both familiar and surreal. I spent my days at Henderson Shipping, ostensibly learning the business but actually conducting the most thorough audit of their operations I had ever performed. I had access to every file, every contract, every financial record. They trusted me completely because they believed I was their salvation, the daughter who had returned home to help save the family business. In the evenings, I attended family dinners where we played at being a normal, loving family. Jessica showed me pictures of her children and talked about her charity work. Jonathan discussed his plans for modernizing the company once their financial situation stabilized, shared stories about their social circle, and asked careful questions about my life during the missing years. I answered their questions with a carefully constructed narrative about struggling to make ends meet, working multiple jobs, and slowly building a modest consulting practice. I talked about tiny apartments and cheap restaurants and the constant worry about making rent. They ate it up, their guilt over abandoning me, mixing with relief that their prodigal daughter wasn't angry or resentful. Meanwhile, I was systematically documenting every weakness in their business, every vulnerability in their operations, and every relationship that could be exploited. I identified which employees were dissatisfied and might be willing to share information, discovered which clients were already considering switching to other providers. I found weaknesses in their contracts that could be leveraged to accelerate client departures. The technology assessment I provided to my father was thorough and professional, recommending specific solutions that would genuinely improve their operations. What I didn't mention was that implementing my recommendations would make Henderson Shipping completely dependent on systems controlled through my various shell companies. "This is incredible work, Madison," my father said, reviewing my 50-page analysis. "You've identified solutions I never would have considered. Where did you learn to think about business problems this way?" "Necessity," I replied truthfully. "When you're working with small businesses that can't afford to make mistakes, you learn to be very careful about understanding the complete picture before making recommendations." He nodded approvingly. "I think you might have inherited more business sense than any of us realized. If only he knew that his struggling daughter had already inherited something far more valuable than business, since she had inherited the power to destroy everything he had built, and she was just getting started." During my 4th week back home, I made my first overt move. It was subtle, disguised as helpful research. But it was the beginning of the end for Henderson Shipping as an independent company. "I've been thinking about your client retention issues," I told Jonathan during one of our regular operational reviews. "Would it be helpful if I reached out to some of the clients you've lost recently? Maybe I could find out exactly why they switched and whether there's any possibility of winning them back." Jonathan looked uncomfortable with the suggestion. "I don't think that's necessary. We understand why they left pricing and technology. Calling them would just be embarrassing." "Not necessarily," I pressed. "If I approach it as a consultant conducting a market research study rather than as a Henderson family member, they might be more willing to give honest feedback. Sometimes companies are more candid with outsiders than they are in exit interviews." My father overheard the conversation and immediately approved the idea. "That's brilliant, Madison. We need to understand what we're competing against if we're going to win back market share." Over the next 2 weeks, I conducted market research interviews with 15 former Henderson Shipping clients. The conversations were illuminating, though not in the way my family expected. These companies had switched to providers in my portfolio not just because of better technology or pricing, but because those providers had actively courted them with customized solutions and exclusive service packages. What made the conversations truly valuable wasn't the information I gathered for my family, but the intelligence I collected about Henderson Shipping's remaining vulnerabilities. I learned which current clients were dissatisfied, which contracts were coming up for renewal, and which decision-makers were most susceptible to competitive pressure. I compiled my findings into a comprehensive report that painted a devastating picture of Henderson Shipping's competitive position. They weren't just behind on technology, they were fundamentally misaligned with market expectations. Their clients wanted flexibility, transparency, and innovation. Henderson Shipping offered tradition, reliability, and personal relationships. The good news, I told my family during a somber conference room meeting, is that these problems are solvable. The bad news is that solving them will require significant changes to how you operate. "What kind of changes?" my mother asked. She had started attending these business meetings recently, her social calendar apparently less important than the survival of the family's financial foundation. I pulled up a PowerPoint presentation I had spent considerable time crafting. Every slide was accurate, every recommendation was sound, and every solution would ultimately increase my control over their operations. First, you need to modernize your technology infrastructure completely, not just software. Upgrades you need integrated systems that can provide real-time tracking, automated scheduling, and predictive analytics. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We've discussed this, Madison. The upfront costs are prohibitive, which is why I recommend the software-as-a-service approach I mentioned earlier. I've been researching providers, and I think I can negotiate contracts that would give you enterprise-level capabilities for a fraction of the traditional licensing costs." My father leaned forward. "What kind of providers?" "There are 3 companies that specialize in logistics management solutions for mid-sized shipping companies: Logiflow, Shipstream, and Freight Forward. All three have excellent reputations and offer the kind of comprehensive solutions you need. What I didn't mention was that I owned controlling stakes in all three companies. If Henderson Shipping signed with any of them, they would essentially be paying rent to use systems I controlled. I would have access to all their operational data, the ability to monitor their client communications, and the power to disable their technology infrastructure whenever I chose. "Can you set up meetings with these companies?" my father asked. "I already have," I replied. "They're very interested in working with Henderson Shipping. In fact, they're willing to offer special pricing as part of a pilot program for established family businesses." The special pricing was I had instructed all three companies to offer Henderson Shipping rates that were genuinely competitive. I wanted them to sign the contracts because the monthly fees weren't my objective. Control was my objective. Over the following month, representatives from all three companies visited Henderson Shipping to demonstrate their systems. The presentations were impressive. The technology was genuinely superior to what Henderson currently used, and the pricing was reasonable enough that even Jonathan couldn't object. My family was amazed by my ability to negotiate favorable terms with multiple technology providers. They saw it as evidence of my consulting expertise and proof that bringing me back into the family had been the right decision. I saw it as the completion of Phase 3 in my long-term plan. Soon, Henderson Shipping would be completely dependent on technology I controlled, operated by employees whose communications I could monitor, serving clients whose loyalty I could influence. But the technology contracts were just the beginning. The real masterstroke was still to come, and it would require patience, perfect timing, and one final revelation that would destroy my family's perception of reality forever. As I sat in my childhood bedroom that night, reviewing the signed contracts that made Henderson Shipping dependent on my technology platforms, I felt a satisfaction deeper than any business success I had achieved. This wasn't just about money or market dominance. This was about justice. For 18 years, my family had been able to pretend I didn't exist. They had erased me from their lives and their memories, confident that their abandoned daughter was too broken and too powerless to ever threaten their comfortable existence. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. 6 months after Henderson Shipping secured the Pacific Maritime contract, I decided it was time for the final act. The performance metrics were coming due for their first quarterly review, and I had spent weeks carefully calibrating the systems to ensure they would fall just short of the guaranteed service levels. Not by much, just enough to trigger the penalty clauses that would devastate their already fragile finances. But as I sat in my childhood bedroom on the night before, I planned to initiate the cascade of failures that would destroy my family's business. Something unexpected happened. Emma, Jonathan's 8-year-old daughter, knocked on my door. "Aunt Madison, can I talk to you?" I opened the door to find her standing in the hallway in her pajamas, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. Her expression was serious in the way that only children can manage when they're trying to understand adult problems that are too big for them. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" She walked into my room and climbed onto the window seat where I used to sit as a child, staring out at the Seattle skyline. "Are Mommy and Daddy going to get divorced?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I had been so focused on my grand plan of revenge that I had somehow managed to compartmentalize the fact that real people, innocent people, would be hurt by my actions. Emma wasn't responsible for what her grandparents had done to me. Neither was her little brother Luke. "Why would you ask that, Emma? They fight a lot now. And Daddy is always working, and Mommy cries sometimes when she thinks we can't see." She looked up at me with eyes that were far too old for her age. "Before you came back, they didn't fight like this." Before I came back, the words hung in the air between us, carrying an accusation that an 8-year-old couldn't possibly understand, but that cut through all my rationalizations and justifications like a knife. "Sometimes adults go through difficult periods," I said carefully. "It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get divorced, but sometimes it does, right? My friend Sophia's parents got divorced last year, and first they fought all the time, and then her dad moved out." I sat down beside her on the window seat, looking out at the city lights that had once seemed so magical to me as a child. "Emma, do you know why I went away when I was young?" She shook her head. "Daddy said you went to school, but that doesn't make sense. School isn't forever, and you were gone forever. I was sent away because my parents thought I didn't fit in with the family. They thought everyone would be happier if I wasn't here. Emma turned to stare at me with the kind of direct intensity that children possess. That's stupid. Families are supposed to stay together. Yes, I said quietly. They are. Is that why you came back? It's because you miss being part of the family. The question was so innocent, so completely free of the cynicism and calculation that had driven every decision I'd made for months, that I found myself unable to answer immediately. Why had I come back? So was it really about justice and revenge, or was it about something much simpler and more painful? I came back because I wanted to matter to someone, I said, the truth slipping out before I could stop it. I wanted to be important to the people who were supposed to love me. Emma nodded, as if this made perfect sense to her 8-year-old worldview. You matter to me and Luke. We like having an aunt. Most of our friends don't have aunts who take them places and help with homework. What about your grandparents? Do you think they're happy I came back? Grandpa talks about you all the time now. He says you're really smart and that you're helping save the company. Grandma shows your picture to her friends and talks about how proud she is that you came home. Each word Emma spoke felt like another weight added to the growing knot of uncertainty in my chest. My parents were proud of me. They talked about me to their friends. They had welcomed me back with genuine love and gratitude. But they had also abandoned a 13-year-old girl and never looked back. They had written me out of their lives so completely that they could pretend I had never existed. Which version of my parents was real? The ones who had discarded me, or the ones who now claimed to love me? Emma, what would you do if someone hurt you really badly, and then later they acted like they had never hurt you at all? She considered. This question, with the seriousness of a philosopher, I guess I'd want them to say they were sorry first, and then I'd want to know they weren't going to hurt me again. What if they couldn't say they were sorry because they didn't remember hurting you? Then I'd remind them. But I wouldn't want to hurt them back, because then I'd be just as mean as them. The wisdom of children, which Emma had just summarized in 2 sentences what I had been struggling with for 18 years. Was I becoming just as cruel as the people who had hurt me? After Emma went back to her room, I spent the night walking through the Henderson mansion, looking at family photographs that told the story of the years I had missed. Jonathan's graduation from high school, then college, then business school, Jessica's wedding, her children's births, family vacations to places I had never seen. 18 years of memories that I wasn't part of. But what struck me most was what wasn't in the photographs. There were no empty spaces where I should have been. There's no visible gaps that suggested someone was missing. My family had simply reorganized themselves around my absence and continued their lives as if I had never existed. That realization was somehow both more painful and more liberating than anything I had experienced during my months of plotting revenge. They hadn't been actively cruel, they had simply forgotten. I wasn't important enough to hate. I was just important enough to ignore. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of triggering the system failures that would destroy Henderson Shipping, I walked into my father's office and told him the truth. Not all of it. I wasn't ready to reveal the full extent of my wealth and power. But I told him about the boarding school years he had never asked about, the holidays I had spent alone, the phone calls that went unanswered, the gradual realization that I had been erased from the family narrative. My father listened in silence, his face growing paler with each detail I shared. When I finished, he sat quietly for several minutes before speaking. Madison, I don't know what to say. I thought we thought you were happy at Cedar Ridge. You stopped calling. You never came home for holidays. We assumed you were building a life there, making friends, finding your place. Did you ever consider that maybe I stopped calling because no one answered? That maybe I didn't come home because no one invited me? He closed his eyes as if the words caused him physical pain. We failed you. I failed you. I was so focused on the business, on Jonathan's future with the company, on Jessica's social development. I forgot that you needed parents who cared about your present, not just your potential future role in the family legacy. It wasn't the complete apology I had imagined demanding, but it was honest acknowledgement of neglect rather than malicious abandonment. My parents hadn't conspired to destroy me. They had simply been so absorbed in their own priorities that they had forgotten I existed. "What can I do now?" he asked. "How can I make up for 18 years of absence?" "You can start by being honest with me about the company situation, not as someone you're trying to protect, but as someone whose advice you actually want." Over the next several hours, my father shared details about Henderson Shipping's finances that he had been hiding from everyone, including Jonathan. The situation was worse than even I had realized. The Pacific Maritime contract was keeping them afloat, but barely. They were one missed payment, one client complaint, one system failure away from bankruptcy. The truth is, Madison, I'm not. Sure, the company can survive in its current form. The industry has changed too much, and we've been too slow to adapt. Maybe it's time to accept that Henderson Shipping's era is ending. It was exactly the kind of vulnerability I had been working to create. The perfect opportunity to reveal my true power and watch my father beg for salvation from the daughter he had abandoned. Instead, I found myself offering genuine help. What if it doesn't have to end? What if there was a way to transform Henderson Shipping into something that could compete in the modern market? How? I spent the rest of the day outlining a comprehensive restructuring plan that would leverage the technology platforms we had already implemented while expanding into new service areas that would differentiate Henderson from their competitors. It was a plan that could genuinely save the company and position it for growth, but it would require significant investment and fundamental changes to how they operated. "This is brilliant," my father said, reviewing my proposals. "But where would we get the capital for this kind of transformation? Might be able to help with that," I said carefully. "I've built some relationships in the venture capital world through my consulting work. There are investors who specialize in helping family businesses modernize and expand." It was true, though I was the investor I was referring to. But instead of using my wealth as a weapon to destroy my family, I was considering using it as a tool to rebuild what we had lost. The next several weeks were unlike anything I had experienced since returning home. Instead of manipulating and deceiving my family, I was working with them as a genuine partner. I helped Jonathan develop new operational strategies that would improve efficiency and customer service. I worked with Jessica to create marketing campaigns that would attract younger, more tech-savvy clients. I collaborated with my parents too. Design a succession plan that would ensure Henderson Shipping could survive for another generation. Most importantly, I began the process of revealing my true identity not all at once, but gradually, allowing my family to understand that their struggling consultant daughter was actually someone who could provide the resources they needed to rebuild. The revelation came in stages. First, I disclosed that my consulting practice was more successful than I had initially let on. Then I admitted that I had been involved in several technology investments that had provided substantial returns. Finally, I revealed that I was in a position to provide the capital investment Henderson Shipping needed to complete their transformation. My family's reaction was a mixture of shock, gratitude, and guilty relief. They were amazed by my success, grateful for my willingness to help, and painfully aware that they had underestimated me for my entire life. "You could have told us," my mother said during one of our conversations about the restructuring plan. "You could have come back as a successful businesswoman and demanded recognition. Why did you let us think you were struggling?" "Because I needed to know if you would love me when I was powerless," I replied. "I needed to know if your affection was real or just convenient, and now you know." I looked around the room where we were sitting, the same formal living room where I had spent countless childhood evenings feeling invisible and unimportant. Now it felt different. Now I was someone my family valued, not because of my wealth, but because they had seen me struggle alongside them and choose to stay. Now I know that we're all capable of being better than we were before. 6 months later, Henderson Shipping completed its transformation into Henderson Logistics, a technology-focused company that provided comprehensive supply chain solutions to businesses across the Pacific Northwest. The company was profitable, growing, and positioned to compete successfully in the modern market. Jonathan had grown into a genuine leader rather than just an inherited title holder. Jessica had discovered talents for marketing and business development that she never knew she possessed. My parents had learned to value collaboration over control. They had begun treating me as a true partner rather than a convenient resource. Most importantly, Emma and Luke had a stable family that worked together, instead of fighting over scraps of a failing legacy. I never did trigger the system failures that would have destroyed Henderson shipping. I never revealed the full extent of my wealth and power. I never got the dramatic moment of revelation and revenge that I had spent years planning. Instead, I got something I hadn't expected to want. A real family that knew my value and a business that reflected the best of what we could accomplish together. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is proving that you're bigger than the hurt. That created you. Sometimes the most powerful response to being forgotten is choosing to be unforgettable for the right reasons. And sometimes the best way to make someone pay for their mistakes is to give them the chance to do better. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.